everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel where I teach lessons of economics useful for students of class 11th and 12th, especially of the CBSE board. And this video marks the beginning of a new chapter, that is determination of income and employment. This chapter has been divided into many parts, and in this video we'll be discussing about the first part, that is introducing the concept. First of all, in order to understand the meaning of this chapter, we have to have a shift in our perspective. Why do we need a shift in perspective? Because we have to shift our thinking from microeconomic perspective to macroeconomic perspective. In my YouTube channel, you can check out a video where I've explained about introduction to macroeconomics, where I've clearly explained about the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics and how it changes human behavior in an economy. So please check out that video, and only then it will be very, very easy to understand this chapter. Anyway, microeconomic perspective is an individual view of economics, because there we are thinking only of one person. Either we are thinking about the consumer or we are thinking about the producer. Every consumer will aim at gathering more satisfaction, while every producer will aim at maximization of one's own profit. So there were many economists before the 19th century who taught that more supply will create more production. More production means more number of people to create those goods. More employment means more income for the laborers. More income for the laborers means they will spend more. And when they spend more, it means the demand of other products will be increasing. But this very set of thinking was the thing that resulted in the Great Economic Depression of 1929. This is because many of the producers started stockpiling goods. They thought that whatever they produce will be sold. But the problem was that most of the money in the economy was converted into goods, and there was very less money for spending or purchasing these goods. This stockpiling of goods resulted in unsold stock. When the stock was unsold and there was very less income, it resulted in falling demand for these goods. When there was a falling demand and there was no need to further produce these goods, people were being fired from their jobs. When many more people lost their employment, there was lesser spending in the economy, and this led to a cascading effect where the entire economy of the US and Europe crashed like a waterfall. It is because all were thinking from a microeconomic perspective. We have the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who proposed a new way of perceiving the economy. And in 1936, he wrote a book where there he explains us that the optimum level or the highest level of income and employment will depend on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. He further states that an economy will be in equilibrium or perfect balance when AD, aggregate demand, is equal to AS, aggregate supply. So this chapter is the thesis of John Maynard Keynes, where he's explaining how is an economy in equilibrium when AD is equal to AS. And that is what we are going to study in this chapter. We have aggregate demand, the first part of the equation. To understand aggregate demand, we have to first refer back to class 11th concept, that is market demand. In class 11th, we might have studied about market demand, where the total demand of one product in the entire market is called as market demand. For example, the market demand of onions refers to the total demand of onions in the entire economy. There we are speaking about the demand of only onions and nothing else. But whereas aggregate demand is the total demand of all goods and services in an economy. A better definition can be aggregate demand is the total expenditure on all goods and services produced in an economy. This is the actual demand where we are spending on all the goods and services created in an economy. So the total expenditure on all goods and services produced in an economy is called as aggregate demand. There are two variations for aggregate demand. The first variation is called as ex ante aggregate demand, which means planned aggregate demand. This will be useful for the end of the chapter, so it is very, very useful to remember this right now. Whereas the next variation is ex post aggregate demand, which is the actual demand or which is currently happening right now. So in the budget of February 1st, we will be planning about the aggregate demand, and that is called as ex ante aggregate demand. Whereas actually what has happened in 2021, that kind of demand will be called as ex post aggregate demand, which is the actual aggregate demand. Aggregate demand has four components. First one is C, that is private household consumption. The next one is I, that is investment by firms. The next one is G, that is government expenditure. And the final component is X minus M, that is exports minus imports. We have already studied this in national income under the expenditure method, and therefore AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. In a two-sector economy, aggregate demand will be only private household consumption plus investment by firms. This is because we are trying to simplify the chapter for class 12. So we will not be considering exports, imports and government expenditure. In this chapter, we will be only studying about aggregate demand in a two-sector economy. And so the formula for us to remember is AD is equal to C plus I, that is aggregate demand is equal to private household consumption plus investment by firms. Now it is very important to draw the aggregate demand curve, and in order to draw the aggregate demand curve, we need a numerical example which will help us to draw the curve on a graph. So here is a small numerical table where we are explaining about how aggregate demand is formed. So first of all, we have the first column here, that is income, and in this column we are assuming that the income of an economy is increasing rapidly but at a steady pace. As the income increases, consumption here, which is the second column, is also increasing but at a slower pace than income. This is because as income increases, consumption also increases. We also try to buy and purchase more and more goods, but we do not try to finish the entire income. So the first thing what we have to notice here in this example is that when the income is 0, that time the consumption is 40. This means that when the income is 0, even then people will be consuming goods. For example, as students, even though we are not earning money, we are still consuming a lot of products on a daily basis. And this kind of consumption, where we are consuming even without income, is called as autonomous consumption. And so, when income is 0, consumption is 40. When income is 100, the consumption is 120. We have seen an increase in the consumption. When income is 200, the consumption is 200. When income is 300, the consumption is 280. And when income is 400, the consumption is 360. So we are seeing a gradual increase in both income and consumption, but consumption is increasing at a slower rate than income. We are keeping investments at a constant rate, the third column, at 40 each. This is because it will be very, very easy for us to understand the relationship between AD and consumption. So now we have these three columns here: income, consumption and investments. So all we have to do is find out AD, and we have already discussed in the previous slide, AD is equal to C plus I. So the first one is 40 plus 40 is 80, 120 plus 40 is 160, 200 plus 40 is 240, 280 plus 40 is 320, and 360 plus 40 is 400. So as we can see here, this entire column has been derived from column C and column I, and this final column is called as aggregate demand. We will have to draw this on the graph here, and so here's a simple diagram. X-axis in a graph will be considered as income, that is the first column. Y-axis will be aggregate demand, which will be showing us how much aggregate demand is increasing. These are the two axes. The first thing is C, which is beginning at point 40. As I explained to you, this is autonomous consumption, so it is not beginning from 0, but it is beginning from 40, and it is moving upwards up to 360. The next is investment, which is once again beginning and constantly continuing at the level of 40. So this is I, which is a parallel line to income. The next is aggregate demand, which is beginning from 80 and moving upwards till 400. And as you can see, AD is a parallel line to C. This is because this gap is the gap between investments and the 0 level here. This is exactly the same measurement. AD is parallel to C because this gap between AD and C is nothing but investments. If you see this, the gap between AD and C is nothing but 40 in each and every case. And so this is how we are supposed to draw an aggregate demand curve. From the aggregate demand curve, we have so many different things to study. The first thing is that AD, or aggregate demand, increases slower than income. That is what we have already seen in this chapter here. Aggregate demand is increasing, but it is increasing at a slower rate than income, which means it began at 80, but instead of crossing 400, it is now meeting income at 400. And as income will continue to increase, aggregate demand will fall below income. The next is that consumption, even without income, is called as autonomous consumption. I've already explained that. There is a positive relationship between AD and I. have explained that while explaining this diagram. And there is the difference between autonomous consumption and induced consumption. This point here is called as autonomous consumption, but consumption is not exactly becoming the same level. It is increasing at an increased level. And this is because as income increases, consumption is also increasing at a slower rate. This increase in the consumption related to the increase in income is called as induced consumption. For example, here, when income was 0, my consumption was only 40. But when my income has suddenly increased to 100, I am not satisfied with only 40, but I want to purchase more goods, and that is why my consumption has increased to 120. And so therefore, because of this, my consumption has been induced by the income. And therefore, that kind of consumption which increases with an increase in income is called as induced consumption. We will move forward to the next part of the formula, that is aggregate supply. So now, if you're spending on all goods and services, the other part has to be the total value of all the goods and services. So in simple terms, aggregate supply is nothing but the total value of all goods and services in an economy. And production is done by all sectors, that is the private, that is the investment by firms, that is the government sector and the foreign sector. And so this is also called as net national income. This is exactly the same formula which we use for national income. The total value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year is called as national income, and it is also called as aggregate supply. This income has two parts. First of all, net national income is denoted by the capital letter Y. So income has two parts. Whenever we are having income, we either consume it or we save it. So AS, or aggregate supply, is equal to consumption plus savings, because AS is equal to Y. Aggregate supply is nothing but the income of the entire economy. From the income, we either consume or either we save, and so therefore AS, aggregate supply, has two parts, that is consumption plus savings. We will move forward to draw the aggregate supply curve just as we drew the aggregate demand curve. And we are following the same example. We have two columns here, income now denoted by the capital letter Y, and consumption denoted by the capital letter C. You can check out the values. The values are exactly the same, 0 to 400 and here 40 to 360. These are the values which are exactly same from the aggregate demand. And now, if you remember, I told you just now, income has two parts. One part is consumed and the remaining part is saved. So when my income was 0 and I have consumed 40, I have got a minus balance of 40, minus 40, and that is my savings, or technically it is called as dis-savings. When my income has increased to 100, my consumption is 120, I have minus 20 as balance, and that minus 20 is my dis-savings. When my income is 200 and I have consumed everything, there is no savings at all. But when my income is 300 and I have consumed 280, my savings is 20. When my income is 400 and I have consumed 360, there is 40 as savings. Now from these three columns, we have to find out AS, that is C plus S. So all we have to do is add this column with this column. 40 minus 40 is 0. 120 minus 20 is 100. 200 plus 0 is 200. 280 plus 20 is 300. 360 plus 40 is 400. And if you see, this column is exactly the same as this column here, income. 0, 100, 200, 300 and 400. So from this table, we have established two things, that aggregate supply is nothing but consumption plus savings, and aggregate supply can also be understood as national income, or Y. So we will have to draw this diagram. So first we have the x-axis, exactly same like aggregate demand. We have the income axis. We have the expenditure axis, and we are now extending the y-axis down because we have even negative values to be portrayed here. The first thing that we have to portray is consumption, exactly the same like aggregate demand. It begins at 40 and is extending to 360. The next one is savings, which is beginning from minus 40 and is actually extending to plus 40, exactly where consumption is supposed to start. So we have savings here, beginning from minus and then extending plus. Now we have aggregate supply, and this aggregate supply is dividing the entire graph at 45 degrees. And this is because the value of AS is exactly the same as income, and therefore 90 degrees is cut or split into two parts by this curve, that is AS. We can call this line as income curve as well, because AS is nothing but not even this value, but it is also showing this value here, that is 0 to 400. Now, the most important point to find out is that this point, when AS or income is meeting C, when AS or income is meeting C. Now, if you follow this is the row here, income is 200, consumption is 200, and aggregate supply is also 200. It is this point where income, that is aggregate supply, and consumption are meeting at this point here. This is the exact same point where savings are 0. Before that it was minus, until now, after that it will be plus. This particular point is called as break-even point, where we do not have neither savings nor dis-savings. The entire concept is 0. Before that, this star denotes the dis-savings, that is minus 40 and minus 20. And after this, we have the heart, which is showing the savings, that is 20 and 40. This is how we are supposed to draw an aggregate supply curve. From the aggregate supply curve, we have so many things to learn. First thing is AS is equal to Y. We established that already in the graph and also in the table. When Y is equal to C, that is when AS is equal to C, this point here, savings is 0, exactly the same here. And that point is called as break-even point. Before that we have dis-savings, and after that we have savings. With that, we come to the end of this video. You can check out my YouTube channel where this video will be available. That is AD and AS has been explained. The next video will be about propensity. Thank you so much for staying tuned till now. If you found this video helpful, please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you so much. Stay educated and stay safe.